Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 52. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit about a book that I've read recently called Living with Darwin. I haven't actually finished the book. I'm on chapter 3 of the book, and what this book does is it really shows the war of ideas between intelligent design and evolution. And this person is clearly biased in favor of evolution. But one of the things he does that's useful is he talks about I would call it 3 categories between the different groups of people within what's called the intelligent design movement. I don't prefer the term intelligent design because I don't think it's forceful enough. As a believer, I don't simply believe that maybe there was some intelligence that behind what we see in the universe. It's obviously more than that. I'm a believer that God did this, Jehovah, Yahweh from the Old Testament, and that Jesus Christ is God's son. Because of that, I obviously believe that God is intelligent and is behind what we see in the universe. But simply from a science perspective, simply claiming that there is an intelligence behind the universe isn't enough for me, but I would technically be considered within that movement, if you would, the ID or the intelligent design movement. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about those 3 groups of people within the movement. Mr. Kitcher is very skeptical that people who are believers can do science. I would say that he's also someone that would say that people are trying to sneak their faith in. Obviously, this is a podcast that is at that intersection of science with faith. And we say over and over again that the faith is foundational and that the science is built on top of it. People don't like to hear that, particularly people who subscribe to scientism. And we've defined scientism before as a discipline or a belief in which you think that the only way to know a thing is through science. And clearly there are plenty of things that you can know that have nothing to do with science. So we talk about something like love, something like hope, faith. These are ideas that have nothing to do with science. And so you can't apply scientific method to them, but yet you can know that you love your family member, let's say. That's something that you can know, and it has nothing to do with science. So that's just one realm or category. The reason why I'm starting out on my YouTube page, for those who are watching on the YouTube channel, is that this is episode 52. And next week will mark the 1-year anniversary of starting this podcast. And so I am expecting I want to do a good, maybe a podcast that is going to be very interesting. I've been talking a lot about racism and the connection between Darwinian evolution and racism, and I think that's what we're going to do for next week's. But I don't hold me to that. But I think that's what the pod that we'll do next week, the topic that we'll do. So that will be a nice 1-year anniversary podcast to do. So that's the only reason why I was looking at this. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do that and like the videos and share them with those who might be interested in this kind of thing. So the book that I am talking about is called Living with Darwin by Philip Kitcher. And like I said, I'm in chapter 3 of the book. We can go down here and look at maybe the Amazon blurb regarding the book. So the blurb says this: Charles Darwin has been at the center of white-hot public debate for more than a century. In Living with Darwin, Philip Kitcher stokes the flames swirling around Darwin's theory, sifting through the scientific evidence for evolution, creation science, and intelligent design, and revealing why evolution has been the object of such vehement attack. Kitcher first provides valuable perspective on the present controversy, describing the many puzzles that blocked evolution's acceptance in the early years, and explaining how scientific research eventually found the answers to these conundrums. Interestingly, Kitcher shows that many of these early questions have been resurrected in recent years by proponents of intelligent design. In fact, Darwin himself considered the issue of intelligent design and amassed a mountain of evidence that effectively refuted the idea. Kitcher argues that the problem with intelligent design isn't that it's not science, as many critics say, but that it's dead science, raising questions long resolved by scientists. But Kitcher points out that it is also important to recognize the cost of Darwin's success, the price of life with Darwin. Darwinism has a profound effect on our understanding of our place in the universe, on our religious beliefs and aspirations. It is in truth the focal point of a larger clash between religious faith and modern science. Unless we can resolve this larger issue, the war over evolution will go on. So, interesting little blurb there. I obviously there are things that I are opinions that are being stated as if they are facts, and this is the issue with these kinds of books. And this is I was reading the chapter 3 today, which was really more about the second group of ID proponents, which we'll get to in a second. But one of the things that he was doing was saying things like, well, all of these controversies or puzzles that people are pointing out, problems with Darwinism, were pointed out back in the 1850s and 1860s, and that was solved back then. There's nothing more to see here now. You're just resurrecting these old ideas that have already been dealt with. And I mean, clearly this person believes this. Mr. Kitcher obviously believes this, but no, these things haven't been dealt with. So, for example, the one that is the biggest is Darwin's admission on the origin of species that the fossil record does not show the multitude of intermediate forms, missing links, you might say, that it should. Darwin admits this clearly. He says it's probably the biggest issue with his hypothesis. We're no closer to finding these intermediate forms, missing links, than ever before, than any time but previously. What Mr. Kitcher does in the book that I thought was interesting is he simply says, well, it's just so hard to fossilize remains that we shouldn't expect to find all of these. Now, that's a convenient answer. It's convenient to say that the missing forms, these intermediate forms, missing links that we should expect to see just aren't there because the fossil record is just spotty. It just never really records these things, and we're just lucky to have the ones that we have. That's convenient. That the hard evidence that you really would need to point to isn't there. So what does he mean when he says here that Darwin amassed a mountain of evidence that effectively refuted the idea of intelligent design? What he's talking about is what we would call microevolution. What we're talking about is one of the examples he gives is that there are insects in the United States that if you look at the cave insect, it is blind because it doesn't need to see because it's in a cave somewhere. And then there are insects that are not in a cave that do have the ability to see. And we see this same thing, let's say in Great Britain, that there are cave insects that don't have the ability to see. And then there are these related insects that are not in the cave that are able to see. And what he points out, and what he says that Darwin would have pointed out, is that cave insects in Britain and cave insects in America are actually much closer than their nearby counterparts rather than their cave counterparts, meaning that you might expect, I think he would claim that the creationist would expect that the British cave insect will be very similar to the American cave insect, and that the British insect outside of the cave is going to be much like the American insect outside of the cave. But instead, it is they are more related to each other in the same locality. And he says, well, natural selection and evolution explains that. And I don't disagree. And I don't think anybody disagrees. And this is the difficulty that I have, that Mr. Kitcher seems to caricature the position of those who believe in creation as if what people might have believed back in the 1800s, and he says this in the book, he says that creationism is in the same place it was back in 1860. These people believe the same thing, that special creation happened, that God created all of the different species. I don't know that I know of anybody who really thinks that God created individual species. One reason for this is that's not what Genesis says. So let's go to Genesis real quick. We'll come back to Mr. Kitcher in a second. But if we go to Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 doesn't use our terms of taxonomy. We if you think about back in your 7th grade science class, you learned about kingdom, phylum. Let's see, the acronym, or the phrase we were given is something like killer penguins choked on fat greasy sardines. Mr. Haney, shout out to him, one of my science teachers back in middle school. So KPCOFGS. So that would be kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Let's make sure that's right. Taxonomy. Okay, domain. We never really talked about domain, but kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you learned that in science class. So why am I bringing that up? Because that's the way we classify various organisms. And the idea that species, which is a very fine-grained difference between organisms, let's say, the idea that people today in 2025 who are creationists are saying that God created individual species, I just don't know of anybody that says that. And the word species is not going to be in the Bible. What we're going to say is that God says that he created different kinds of things. He created different kinds. It doesn't say different species. So what is the kind? Is that on the order of class or order of family? I don't know what the answer to that is. But just because there were people in the 1860s who were unfamiliar with, again, something that Darwin was able to show, which is natural selection, doesn't mean that people today somehow reject natural selection. And the idea that that's what people think seems to be a straw man. I don't know anybody that thinks that. So if you go down and you look at God beginning to create wildlife, day 1, God creates light, separates the light from the darkness. He calls the light day and the darkness night in verse 5. In verse 6, he creates an expanse, a firmament in the midst of the waters that divides the waters above the firmament from the waters below the firmament. And then the scripture says on day 3, God begins to create grass and herbs and trees that have fruit. And later on, we see this phrase in verse 12, the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. Now, we're going to see that phrasing later when you get down into day 5 and 6, where the scripture says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, God created the great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the water abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. So here, what is a kind? Is that a family, class, genus? I think we can be pretty clear that it's not species. We see speciation. We see certain groups of animals that give rise to what we would consider to be different species or subspecies even. But scripture doesn't say God created individual species. It says he created different kinds. Now, this isn't meant to be a biology textbook anyway, but if we look at what it simply says, this doesn't go against anything that we see biologically, anything that we see in terms of taxonomy. So those like Mr. Kitcher here, who would say that believers think that God especially created every single species, I just don't know of anybody that says that. And I'm somebody would be considered far extreme. He would consider me to be a Genesis creationist, which I actually like that term. I think I'm going to start using it. I actually like the term. I think the term young earth creationist is one of the things that happens is people use the term young earth creationist to distinguish from old earth creationist. And I just like the term Genesis creationist. I think he would equate that with young earth creationist, but I think there are people that would consider themselves old earth creationists that would say, we believe in Genesis too. But when they say that, to say you believe in Genesis but reject the timelines of Genesis seems to be the issue. It's the rub. And it's interesting to see someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight. He's actually against all of us. For him to say, yeah, those young earth people, they actually believe the Genesis account. Those who would claim an older earth or like a theistic evolution or progressive creation framework, those people aren't taking Genesis literally. They are saying that it's more poetic, or maybe it's some kind of mythic or mythological phrasing of what would have happened at the beginning. They believe that creation occurred, but not in the specifically in the way that Moses describes for us in Genesis. So it's interesting that he uses those terms. So let's get to those three groups of people, and then I want to do some. I want to kind of chat with ChatGPT a little bit and see what it has to say about some of these things. So what I'm going to do is, he uses three different terms. The first one is the one I just mentioned, a Genesis creationist. The second term is, he calls them, let's see what the three, let me see if I can ask ChatGPT and if it will, let's see if it's gonna, if my camera is gonna not turn on. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're gonna tell ChatGPT that I'm reading Philip Kitcher's book entitled Living with Darwin. He divides the intelligent design community into three categories. The first is Genesis creationists. The third is, I believe it's anti-selectionists. I don't remember the adjective before creationists for the second group. What is that group called? I don't remember what that group was called. Theistic creationists? I don't think that's right. Theistic creationists? I don't believe that that's right. I'm reading the book on Kindle, so I don't really mean to like pause the podcast here to find that, but I do want to get it right. But I don't think it's theistic creationist. It's something else, and I think I can. Novelty creationists. Okay. So this is, again, I don't know that the book is available to ChatGPT clearly, because he calls it novelty creationist. So what he means by novelty creationists is that they take part of the Genesis accounts, but they don't take all of it. For example, the timeline specifically. So he's vehemently opposed to, again, what he would call us Genesis creationists. So let me try to tell you the difference between the three. So you have Genesis creationists, you have, what did I just call them? It's novelty creationists and anti-selectionists. Now, Genesis creationists believe the biblical record and are able to recognize in nature, in science, that these things line up with that. Now, he would say that that's not true, that we are cherry picking things and ignoring all of the mountains of evidence. We're going to get to the mountains of evidence once again in a second, but he would say that's what he would say. But I would say, no, we're looking at the evidence, we're looking at the science, and we see that it corroborates the biblical record. So to be fair, we don't believe the Bible because of science. We recognize that the science lines up with the Bible, and that might seem subtle, but there is a difference. So yes, I am beginning with trusting the scriptures, but then I'm finding that as I'm looking at the science, that it lines up with the scriptures. So that's the distinction here. So he would, because we have these three categories, one of the ways to think about this is, what is the departure in each case? And so they are related in that they all are saying that there is probably creation or design of some kind that is evident in nature. That's what the three groups have in common. So they would all be under what's called this intelligent design or ID umbrella. For the Genesis creationists, there are three departures from Darwinism. The first departure is the idea of the ancient earth. Okay, this is the thing that distinguishes the Genesis creationists from the other two. That's why people often will call us young earth creationists, because that's really the thing that makes what we think different than those other two groups, that they do not espouse that timeline of a few thousand years since the beginning of creation. So that's what we find in Genesis. So that's why we believe it. But then we also see, if you go back and look at my interview with Dr. Don DeYoung, we talked about some of the evidence for a younger earth than what people often describe. And if you understand that the book of Genesis also describes a global flood, that global flood explains a lot of the fossilization that we do see. And so if there were millions and millions of organisms that were buried in a global flood, that would explain a lot of the fossils that we find. And it would explain how you find just all different kinds, how you find fossils on tops of mountains, for instance, which I don't hear a plausible explanation other than the global flood, or why you would find marine fossils on tops of mountains. Now, the Bible gives us the reason for that, which is that the waters covered the mountains, and that's how those fossils would have gotten there. So in this case, that's the main departure of the Genesis creationists. Now, when you go to the second group doesn't go with the young earth, let's call it, or the young universe. So they would say, well, we believe that the universe is old, but where their departure is that they don't necessarily believe in evolution. So they don't necessarily believe in evolution, and they are able to point out that there are parts of Darwinian evolutionary theory that they just can't get on board with, that it seems clear that there's something where God would have intervened. They also do not believe in, let's say, a common ancestor for all life. And that would be the main thing that is the departure for them. So obviously Genesis creationists don't believe that either. But in this case, I keep blanking on the term, but it's novelty creationists. The novelty creationists actually do believe in an ancient earth, but they don't necessarily believe in a common ancestor to all life. That is the thing that is that I'm reading chapter 3 of his book, and he's really going hard at. There's just all this evidence for a common ancestor. So what is all of this evidence that he points out? Well, he essentially says, if you look at things like common structures, then in different organisms, then that is evidence that they all had a common ancestor. So if you look at apes and humans, for instance, and you see similarities, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, hands that look similar in these different structures, and he seems incredulous. He seems not to be able to understand how a creator might use and reuse design parts in different kinds of species. This is the thing that I can't tell if he truly can't see that, or if it just is one of these things where he ridicules the idea of the creator, and then is not able to see how a creator might have created things the way that he did. So this is where the topic of, we've talked about this before, it's the argument from what's called dysteleology, bad design. This is what came up in this chapter. I get a little angry about that because these people will almost always bring up the idea of, well, a good engineer wouldn't do this like this. These people are never engineers that say this, right? So as an engineer, it's always interesting to see these biology types and these professors that never did a class in engineering design in their life or anything like that begin to tell you how they would be able to design a better knee than God did. Or they're saying that God couldn't have done it because if he was so smart, if he was so intelligent, he would have designed knees differently, or he would have designed these various tubes differently in animals so that they don't get twisted or tied. He would have given everybody photosynthesis so that we could all get our energy directly from the sun and we wouldn't have to eat. These are the kinds of things that get said, and these thought exercises, these people will say these things, and then when you point out that there's nothing scientific about you saying that, when you point out that you're not using science to refute this, you're simply using these so-called thought exercises rather than saying, well, I just can't see that, or I don't want to see that. This is what happens here. So the second, so the first one is Genesis creationists. Their main departure from the other groups is that they do not believe in the ancient time scale that is often put out here. They instead go with the Genesis timescale of several thousand years since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the earth. The second group is the novelty creationist group. And what their departure is that they don't go along with the single ancestor of all living things, right? And this is the thing, this is the problem, is that if you look at the evidence that Mr. Kitcher said that Darwin came up with, it's all microevolution stuff. It's all, well, you see horses and zebras and donkeys, that they're all related. And so can't you see that all of them trace back to a single ancestor? And my answer to that is no, I can't see that. I can see how donkeys and horses and zebras are related. I can see how these different grasses are related. I can see how those different birds are related. That there are different kinds of things. What I don't see is how the grass and the bird and the donkey all came from the same thing. And you can't show that either. And so I want to be clear here. You can't show that. What you do is you extrapolate to that. You can show that different kinds of birds have these variations. You can show different types of plants have variations. You can show different types of trees have variations. Different types of horse type creatures or cat or dog type creatures have variations. What you're not going to show is the cat dog hybrid, the ape human hybrid, the horse giraffe hybrid, whatever it is. Those things don't exist in the fossil record. When you ask for specifics on how that would happen exactly, that you would come up with you would come to something like a giraffe. How exactly? Give some scenario. There is never anything given. And then the biggest thing is the evolution part itself. And this is where they would believe in evolution, but again, not this common ancestry of all living things. So the final group is the anti-selectionist. And what, again, they would say is they would not agree with the Genesis creationists on the young earth. And they would be fine with saying that there is a common ancestor of all living things. Their issue is with the mechanism of evolution itself. What they would say is, it seems unlikely that you just use basically what we've just mentioned, that all of this evidence is for microevolution. What none of it shows is changes of different types or kinds of species. First of all, it's not observable, which is, again, a convenient thing, that you can't ever observe the dog turning into a cat, the giraffe turning into a horse or an elephant, the grass turning into some type of mammal, you never see that progression. All you see are different kinds that are related. But the branching of that all the way back to a single ancestor is the thing that is the question. But they beg the question by simply saying, well of course, it was that this is all the evidence that shows you that there was a tree. It's like looking at the branch that looking at the tips of branches of tree, or what looks like a tree, when actually it's just a bunch of bushes. And so if you looked at a bunch of individual bushes that are all together and all you could see are the leaves on top, and you believe that all of that goes down to a single tree trunk, when actually it's just a bunch of bushes that are all planted next to each other. So you planted all these individual bushes, but if all you could see were the tops of the bushes, and they're all seem to be next to each other and be very similar in some different ways, you might conclude, oh, that all of that leads down to a single tree. But if you were to actually look and see, you'd find that it's just a bunch of bushes that are planted right after the other. This is actually what's happening here. When we look at all of these different organisms, and there are all of these similarities and things, we actually never see that these branches all go down to a single trunk. What they do is they extrapolate, and they say that that's what happened. But what's actually happened is that God planted various kinds of life on the earth, and that created the abundance of and the biodiversity that we now see. But when you point this out, you're said to be saying something that's anti-scientific, or saying something that is that you can't corroborate, which of course you can't corroborate what they're saying either. So those are the three different groups. What I'd like to do here is ask ChatGPT a little bit about this, and what I'd like to do is just see what the answers are here. Mr. Kitcher claims that there is an abundance of evidence for Darwinian evolution, namely that all life is derived from a single ancestor. Can you give me some examples of such evidence? Okay, so he says the fossil record, Archaeopteryx. So that was in the chapter I've been reading. Genetic evidence. Genetic similarities between species are one of the strongest supports for the idea of a common ancestor. For instance, humans share about 98% of their DNA with chimpanzees, suggesting a close common ancestor. The more distantly related species are, the greater the genetic differences, but the patterns of similarities and differences in DNA sequences across species align with evolutionary expectations. So he gives ChatGPT gives me 7 different things. I don't know that Kitcher says all of these, but this is good enough. So fossil record, by the way, what is this? Well, the fossil record shows a gradual progression of life forms over time. Transitional fossils, such as those between fish and amphibians, provide strong evidence of evolutionary changes over time. So let's start with the fossil record one and maybe talk about the genetic evidence one. The comparative anatomy one is an interesting line as well. But what we're going to do here is we're actually just going to simply say, we're going to ask ChatGPT, is it possible that these lines of evidence let's put it, let's ask it this way. How might a Genesis creationist, or as a Genesis creationist, I'm obviously going to simply say that couldn't all of these be evidence of a common creator? But I don't want to lead ChatGPT on precisely. I would ask ChatGPT to respond to that. Could you respond to the idea that all of these lines of evidence could be interpreted as suggesting a common creator rather than a common ancestor. The idea that all the evidence supporting Darwinian evolution could be interpreted as suggesting a common creator rather than a common ancestor is a viewpoint often held by those who embrace theistic interpretations of biology. However, there are several points that can be made to highlight the difference between the two interpretations. So again, now what they're doing is ChatGPT is giving me the evolutionary evidence versus the creationist interpretation. Now, what's interesting here is evidence is evidence. To call it evolutionary evidence is essentially saying that the evidence points to evolution rather than saying this is what the evidence is and this is how we're going to interpret it. So, for example, the evidence for evolution, such as the fossil record, genetic similarities, tend to show a gradual process of change over time marked by transitional forms and patterns of divergence rather than the sudden appearance of fully formed species. Now, there are some that point to the Cambrian explosion. So that's what I would probably ask about. The creationist interpretation that's given here is that a common creator could account for the similarities, but a view often implies that species were created in their present forms or that God designed species with certain inherent similarities, but the gradual progression of life forms So for example, this idea of creation of instantaneous or separate acts for each species. So let's ask about that specifically. You say that the evidence doesn't. Let's talk about the fact that that you mentioned that the view of creation is that of instantaneous or separate acts for each species. Can you cite any creationist that believes that? So what you're doing here, let's see. His view is that God created each kind of organism in a fully formed state. So here's Ken Ham, who's still around. He rejects the idea that species gradually evolve over time and instead holds that. So do any of those people, so you're right to ask for clarification. The idea of instantaneous or separate acts for each species is more commonly associated with young Earth creationism, which posits that God created all life forms in a relatively short period of time. Yeah. So once again, Henry Morris believed that God created all species in their current form, and there has been no significant change in life forms since the creation event. That would be interesting if I'm not sure about that. Because as we've already seen, like what ChatGPT will do is they will say something. And so I would be interested to see, can you give a quote from any of these people where they ever say that they believe that all species are just as they were since the beginning? So they basically talk about old Earth creationists and theistic evolution as well. So I'm about out of time for today, but what we'll do is we'll ask one more question. Can you actually give I'm not aware that any of these people ever claimed that all species that exist were created that way at the beginning. Can you give a quote from any of them in which they explicitly reject the idea of adaptation? So then they're saying, ChatGPT tells me that you're right to ask for clarification. Many young Earth creationists do not outright reject the idea of adaptation. Again, I don't know of anybody that does, right? So nobody does, but what they're going, but that's already been claimed that that's what they believe. So, or that's what we believe. So they typically reject the idea of one species evolving into a completely different species over time, which is the core of Darwinian evolution. Correct. So this is the thing we're rejecting. We're saying we see this kind of thing become slightly different, but there are limits. And I think that's probably where we'll end tonight, is asking ChatGPT about evidence for limits. So Henry Morris discusses the concept of variation within kinds, but he does not advocate for the type of adaptation or saying, well, of course he doesn't, right? Like, but the question is, he acknowledges variation within species. Ken Ham acknowledges that adaptation within a kind is possible. Sarfati, he explicitly accepts variation and adaptation within kinds. So this is the point I'm making. There's a straw man that even ChatGPT in this case says is they're setting up this straw man that you don't believe in adaptation, which Darwin would call natural selection. I don't like the term natural selection because to say selection is denoting some type of intelligence, right? What do you mean selection? How does nature select something? Well, you're smuggling in this idea of agency to nature. Nature doesn't have agency. And so when you start looking at the design that we're seeing, you have to use these terms like agency, that we are hard coded to do this. You have to use that kind of terminology because that's what makes sense. And then if you're called on it, then they say, well, no, I don't really mean that it's hard coded. I don't really mean it's designed to be this way. But that is what they mean. But they don't want the implications of an intelligence behind it. So it's interesting that when pressed, you don't actually, what was said earlier, which again, I would say that there are plenty of proponents of evolution that would say similar things. This is what young Earth creationists believe. And then when pressed on it, you go, who actually doesn't believe that there's adaptation and variation? Who actually doesn't believe that? And the answer is nobody says that there's not adaptation, because it's clear. And again, I'm thankful that Darwin points this out. But what Darwin was going against was the idea of special creation of all species. He was saying that doesn't seem to be the case. But then what he did is he went so far in the opposite direction, is that he began to say that everything came from a single ancestor. And for that, he can't show it. And we haven't been able to show it since. And what they are now doing is saying, well, the fossil record is not going to show it because it hasn't gotten any closer in 150 years. So it's interesting here that young Earth creationists here are described as people that don't believe in adaptation until I press, or they believe that all species were created that way at the beginning. And they're saying all these people believe that. And I go, well, I don't remember anybody saying that. Can you show me a quote from that? And then ChatGPT says, well, actually, no, that they don't. Nobody ever says that. They actually all acknowledge adaptation, because how can you not? That's clearly what we see scientifically. What we don't see is the macroevolutionary part. We don't see the extrapolation to one kind of thing turning into a completely different kind of thing. Okay, so that quickly, just we kind of got to dig into the differences between the Genesis creationist, what he would call the novelty creationist, and what he would call the anti-selectionist. And another way of thinking of this is what ChatGPT says here, that what he calls, what Mr. Kitcher calls the Genesis creationist, is really synonymous with what we would call the young Earth creationist. That's the more popular term. And what Mr. Kitcher would call the novelty creationist really fits into what is called the old Earth creationist, who the group of people that say, we do believe in an ancient Earth, but a lot of this evolution stuff, no, God designed these things to be this way. This idea of a common ancestor of everything, no, I don't think so. So that what he would call novelty creationists is generally the term would be old earth creationists. And then finally, I think something like theistic evolution or progressive creation, that's that final group of people that Mr. Kitcher would call, he would call them anti-selectionists, where they have some serious issues with the Darwinian evolutionary synthesis, but they are not willing to say that the earth is young. They're not willing to also say that there hasn't been a common ancestor of all things. They would say there has been a common ancestor of all things, but we believe that God intervened and used evolution in the macro sense to come up with the biodiversity that we see. That God did it that way. And so that's that third view, which again I would say is theistic evolution, where you believe evolution, but not quite all the way where you're saying that God is not involved. Theistic would mean, hey, God had a hand in it. So those are really the three different groups. But I like Mr. Kitcher's description of them. I don't know that anti-selectionist is a accurate description of the theistic evolution or progressive creation folks. I don't know that that would be a good one, but I do like the idea of, I like the Genesis creationist term. I like that because that's really what it comes down to. Do you trust the Genesis account? Do you read it at face value or not? On this channel, we really point to the Genesis accounts. What we see there in those chapters is reliable, and there's nothing that we found scientifically that goes against it. In fact, what we continually see is how much of the science that we're finding more and more lines up with what we find in the book of Genesis. So the Bible can be trusted. That's it for today's show. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep the faith.